Good afternoon or good evening, wherever we are, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along here today. It's great once again to be hosted by the Arab Organisation for Human Rights in the UK. The seminar today, which will probably actually be slightly shorter than we had anticipated, we have, I was going to say 3 speakers. I'm counting myself as a half speaker. We've got 2.5 speakers when we were going to be 3.5. But nonetheless, our seminar today is entitled President Trump's Deal of the Century and UAE-Saudi Endorsement. Just before I go any further, I should just properly introduce myself. My name is Rhys Davis, actually Davis with an E, unlike the spelling on the sign at the front. I'm a barrister at Temple Garden Chambers. I specialise in my international practice in international criminal law, international human rights. I'm a member of the List of Counsel for things like the International Criminal Court, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, amongst other things. I have a particular interest in the Middle East and the rights of journalists, and I've just come back from the West Bank a couple of weeks ago. I have had the pleasure of speaking with the AOHR on a number of occasions, and they certainly provide a diverse and interesting range of seminars on important topics, including today. I should also say that the AOHR is a UK non-governmental organisation, and its stated aim is to promote human rights culture in the world, and it advocates human rights in general, as well as the rights of Arab citizens in particular. And Mohammed, who many of you will know, is at the back of the room, or he's popping in and out to make phone calls, as he often does, because he's a very busy man. And I'm also asked to let you know that you can find out more about the AOHR by going to the website, which is aohr.org.uk. We find ourselves speaking about this topic today because I think it was on the 22nd of last month we had the first tranche of the so-called Deal of the Century unveiled. There are 2 parts to it. There's an economic part and a political part, and all we've had so far is really the economic angle. Lawyers and activists and humanitarians generally will be looking at the deal and what unfolds over the next 6 months very carefully. Thus far, nothing of any political substance has been unveiled, and many observers are perhaps understandably concerned as to what the current proposals actually mean going forwards. And as lawyers, we will be concerned with the legality of any deal, of any compromise, and we'll have particular concern about the right to self-determination. The part of the plan that's been unveiled so far is called the Peace to Prosperity Plan, and I understand that the economic aspect of that will be, or of the plan, will be announced in November. Concern abounds that without a political framework and without any real detail as to what the politics of the situation will be, and that's even, by the way, before the practicalities and the reality of the situation as to what level of consensus will be achieved once the totality of the plan is announced. But concern abounds at this stage that what, without a political suggestion and solution, what is the point of an economic solution? In that governments, individuals, donors are perhaps unlikely to be in a particular rush to pledge cash and investment without any real knowledge of the underpinnings. The deal so far, as I understand it, is a proposal of pumping about $50 billion worth of cash into Palestine and also neighbouring countries. But many will be wondering rather nervously, I suspect, what the trade-off will be for the promise of aid and investment. And the special rapporteur at the UN on the situation of human rights in the OPT, of course, unsurprisingly, has picked up on this, and he has said and it seems to me that this must be right. He says, without the framework of international law, any peace plan, including the forthcoming proposal from the US, will crash upon the shoals of political realism. And he goes on to say in a press release which came out a few days ago, prior plans for the Middle East peace over the past 5 decades have all failed, in large part because they did not seriously insist upon a rights-based approach to peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And he also says that international law built upon the principles of humanitarian protection, human rights, equality and justice had been expressed in hundreds of United Nations resolutions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He further said, animating these resolutions is the vision that the law, when purposefully applied, can offset a lopsided power relationship between two parties and ensure that all are equal before the law. But it seems to me that the nail has been hit right on the head when he says, without the framework of international law, any peace plan will crash upon the shoals of political realism. And from a lawyerly perspective, he highlighted a number of further critical legal matters which will be essential, their resolution will be essential if and when we see a sensible political proposal. When I keep referring to political proposals, inherent with any political proposal will be the legal framework which will give rise to the questions of self-determination, human rights of everybody in Palestine, the legality and the way, and of course this is perhaps one of the most controversial aspects of all this, of the annexation of East Jerusalem and also settlements in the West Bank, as well as the rights of refugees. So there is so much which is still left unsaid. When Mohammed asked me to host and moderate today, of course I sat down and I did my research about the specifics of the proposals, and what struck me was the reality, which was at this stage that there is no real deal that exists. And I know that Bill and Jenny will speak about some of the political sides of things, and I'll introduce our other panelists in a few moments' time. But at the moment, whilst this has been touted by Kushner as a sort of 21st century Marshall Plan, at least in the Marshall Plan, everyone was alive to the political and legal realities of post-war Europe. And at this stage, without knowing what will be unveiled probably in November, it's difficult to be particularly optimistic. And that's not to say, of course, that one should be overly pessimistic. You never know. It could be that Trump, the great deal maker, actually pulls something out of the hat. But we'll wait for that to happen when it happens. There were one or two rather choice quotes which I read when I was doing my research, and I won't read out all of them, but one which I thought was perhaps particularly apposite was a quote which I read from Robert Saltoff, who is the executive director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And he said that positive economic proposals will be lost by an attempt to skirt around Palestinian rights. And he went on to say that unlike a real estate transaction in which one party gets the property and the other party gets the cash, a Middle East peace deal starts and ends with the two parties as neighbours, stuck with each other sharing a duplex for eternity. Whilst of course I suspect most people would welcome significant and serious, meaningful inward investment, many people, as I mentioned at the outset, will probably be rather circumspect at what the payoff is, because of course in this situation, as Saltoff wrote, you will end up with the two neighbours sharing that duplex. So there has to be a real and sensible political and legal framework for that. one thing which I will mention, we're being recorded, and I understand this is being live streamed. I think it's on Al Jazeera. Is that Chatham House rules do not apply today, so everything is on the record. Those of you who are minded, please do tweet about what's being said today and post on Facebook as you see fit. What I'm going to do is pass over now to Bill Law and ask him to speak on what are the real motivations for Saudi Arabia and the UAE to impose any deal, such as that deal may be, on Palestine and neighbouring countries. Those of you who I recognise here today who've attended previous seminars from the AOHR will know Bill. Bill is an award-winning journalist, formerly of the BBC between, I think, 1995 and about 5 or 6 years ago. Bill has extremely extensive, I don't know what you've been spending, extensive experience in the Middle East and the Gulf. He's a documentary maker. He is a journalist, a writer, a thinker, and has spoken at a number of these events in the past. Bill, if I may, can I pass over the crystal ball to you, and perhaps you can tell us what those motivations are and give us your views.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rhys, and thank you, AOHR, for the opportunity to be here. And I look forward to hearing Jenny's comments as well. And again, thanks to you all for coming. I think so I've been charged with attempting to answer the question, what are the real motivations for Saudi Arabia and UAE to impose the deal on the Palestinians and neighboring countries. I think I want to do what one of my editors used to say to me, which is, Bill, what is the context? So I want to set the context, if I may, and take a few minutes doing that. And I want to look at the motivations for Trump, Netanyahu, and what I'm calling not the deal of the century, but the steal of the century. And that is the killing of the two-state solution. I think it's important to understand that, and not to underestimate Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner is oftentimes presented, particularly in the liberal American media, as a kind of idiot savant who wanders blithely through the landmines of a field and somehow survives. He's not. He's a very shrewd and calculating operator who learned his smarts in the very tough jungle of New York real estate, wheeling and dealing. So for the moment that Jared Kushner was assigned the Middle East brief, he's played a subtle and thus far effective hand on behalf of both the West Bank settler movement and his family friend, Benjamin Netanyahu. Kushner, whose family foundation has given generously to settler projects, has carefully constructed a strategy designed to win by losing. The deal was never intended to work. Rather, its modus operandi is to force Palestinians into a corner from which there is no escape, and where the only answer to the peace deal is no. Now, Kushner learned this trick from his days acquiring rent-controlled properties in Manhattan, New York, forcing sitting tenants out, refurbishing the flats, and then putting them back on the market as luxury properties. It's a squeeze play, a combination of withdrawal of services together with an offer of some financial compensation, nicely wrapped in veiled and not so veiled threats along the lines of, accept this or it only gets worse. Kushner has neatly applied the lessons learned in Manhattan to the deal of the century in the Middle East. And his henchmen are two men who worked for Donald Trump. One of them is the bankruptcy lawyer, David Friedman, now the U.S. ambassador to Israel. And the other is Jason Greenblatt, another Trump lawyer who is serving as Kushner's advisor. And both of these gentlemen are hard right supporters of the settler movement and the annexation of Palestinian land in the West Bank. And in the eyes of Kushner, Netanyahu et al., the path to peace lies through the seizure of what is left of most of the West Bank, including its most valuable agricultural asset, the Jordan Valley. It goes without saying, therefore, that Kushner's Peace to Prosperity document, which Rhys mentioned, has something to say about real estate and the settling of land claims. It's right there on page 19 if you take the time to have a perusal. Project 1, Property Ownership Resolution. Enhance court capacity to quickly and effectively resolve property disputes and contested ownership claims. So here's the game. Annex as much as possible, as quickly as possible, under the cover of pursuing a peace deal that the Palestinians can only say no to. Declare those lands and buildings already annexed as legally belonging to Israel. We've seen that with Golan. We've seen it. And of course, Friedman himself said that some, if not all, of the West Bank could and should be annexed to Israel. So whatever's left over, you then go to the court to decide who gets what. And I think we can guess who's courts and who's judges. Peace to prosperity doesn't say anything about it, but I think we know the answer. The message is clear to the Palestinians. If you don't take what is on offer, it's going to get a hell of a lot worse. And we've already seen how Trump has made things as unbearable as possible with the cutting of numerous aid projects, the humiliations inflicted upon individuals like Saeb Erekat. It goes on and on. So it's going to get a hell of a lot worse, but guess what? We have made it impossible for you to take what is on offer. Because how could the Palestinians accept this proposal? How could they possibly accept it? So guess what? I'm speaking in the voice of Jared Kushner here. The two-state solution is well and truly dead. The path to a greater Israel is secured. Welcome to the new reality of Palestinian Bantustans in the West Bank and Gaza. And oh yes, we promised to throw cash at you, 50 billion. It's not all going to the Palestinians, apparently. Some of it will, most of it will, perhaps. Now, that's a lot of dosh. If you do what is commanded of you, if you don't, well, that money is off the table. And when you say no, we will paint you as ungrateful hypocrites. We keep presenting peace to you. We keep making you offers. You keep saying no. You're the ones who are the problem in this whole scenario. So that's the game. And I think Kushner's playing it very well. And that's in part because of the role that the Saudis and the Emiratis are playing in this scenario. One of the things that Jared Kushner did very early on in the presidency of his father-in-law was he connected with Mohammed bin Salman. And it's no mistake that Mohammed bin Salman, or rather President Trump's first overseas visit was to Riyadh. And in that visit, he green-lighted Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, the two power players in the region, in the Arab section of the region, I should say, setting aside Iran. He basically green-lighted them to get along and do whatever they wanted to do. And we've seen what that has led to. Particularly with Mohammed bin Salman, who's only 33 years old. He's ambitious. He's arrogant. There's no doubt he's bright. And certainly he recognized that the Saudi economy needed to change, and he needed to loosen things up in terms of how young people perceive the society in which they live. And he's doing that, and he's gained actually quite a lot of support in so doing. He's also executed dozens and dozens of people. He's jailed hundreds of people, including the women who fought for the right to drive. They remain, many of them, in jail. All right, so let's look at what the Saudi motivation is in terms of supporting this steal of the century. Because really, when you think about it, what it means is, in a final and terribly, truly awful way, Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed are abandoning the Palestinians. Now, it's true that his father, King Salman, has said no. The 2002 deal, that must stand. We must have on the 67 lines a two-state solution. It's true he said that, and he rather rebuked his son. But the fact of the matter is that for much of the time, King Salman is not really there. He's in and out. And he won't be king very much longer. And Mohammed bin Salman effectively runs this country. So you have a situation where the Palestinians have been abandoned by the Gulf. All right, so why are the Saudis doing this? What are they getting in return for throwing Palestinians under the bus and throwing away their hopes and their rights for a state? Well, first of all, for the Saudis, it's to shore up their relationship, or their alliance, rather, against Iran. Because the Saudis are really spooked by Iran. There's no question they're spooked by Iran. And it goes all the way back to 1979 and the Iranian Revolution. So they see that by gaining the support of the Israelis, which is thus far the only nuclear-armed country in the region, that they will have a powerful friend to enable MBS to assert his desire to be seen as the leader of the Arab world. And the Saudis have made it clear that if Iran gets to nuclear capability, well, they'll get a bomb too. But at this stage, they don't have the bomb. And so the Israelis are actually quite useful in that regard. The other thing to bear in mind is that Israel is also a powerful economic ally. And Mohammed bin Salman, as I said earlier, recognized that the Saudi economy needs to change. So he's conducted this really thorough revolution of the Saudi economy. He's shaken it up big time. He needs the support of big corporations. He needs the support of countries like Israel. Israel is an economic powerhouse in the region. So Mohammed bin Salman will look to, and does look to, Israel to assist him in carrying out the Vision 2030 project, which is what his revolution, economic revolution, is all about. And finally, by supporting the peace plan, by supporting Kushner, he ensures continued support from Donald Trump over the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. Now, I have no question in my mind that Mohammed bin Salman is ultimately responsible for the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I knew Jamal. He was a good journalist. He was not a dissident, actually. He was quite close to the ruling family. He raised criticisms about the pace with which Mohammed bin Salman was carrying through his Vision 2030. And he had to leave the country because it was becoming difficult for him. Mohammed bin Salman was so concerned and so angry at the thought of this one individual sitting in Washington writing columns that when you go back and read them are not particularly condemnatory, that he had him brutally murdered in Istanbul, in the consulate. Donald Trump doesn't care. Donald Trump embraces him. And as long as Donald Trump is president, Mohammed bin Salman will escape from really any responsibility for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. All right, what is the UAE up to? Why is Mohammed bin Zayed MBZ backing this steal of the century? Well, I think that the UAE actually is less concerned about Iran because, for one reason, the UAE does a lot of business with Iran. I think there are 500,000 Iranian expats living in Dubai, and a lot of Dubai's wealth has come from the way in which they were able to make money in the first set of sanctions against Iran. So there are lots of business interests there. I think they see Iran as less of a threat. They're less troubled by Iran. And I think we've seen that where in this escalation of the confrontation between the Americans and Iran, that the Emiratis have actually pulled back. They're now saying, well, we don't know that the Iranians are behind the attacks on the tankers. we'll have to wait and see. We don't know that they are responsible for the attacks on the pipelines. Let's wait and see. So they're pulling back again. I think it's because they're thinking about the economic consequences of if something such as a hard military action came through. It would hurt them economically. But something else that the UAE does, and they do a lot of, is they do business with Israel. They have done for a long time. They do a lot of business with spyware, tech innovation. The Israelis are one of the leading countries in the world for technical innovation, spyware, malware, not all bad things, lots of good things too. And the UAE has been very clever in positioning itself to be at the forefront of the high-tech revolution. And in fact, they have carried out a number of surveillance activities of a number of people, politicians, the Emir of Qatar. So the Israelis actually see an opportunity to engage with the Emiratis, particularly in this area of technology. And there's an interesting fact here. In the 1980s, Israel, in order to encourage Jews coming from Russia, they set up a scheme to encourage the emigres who had expertise in high tech. You know, some of them may well have come out of the KGB to set up businesses in Israel. And of course, that's when you can begin to see also the really negative impact of hard right politics, settler movement, also beginning to really gain pace in the late 80s, and beginning to again to acquire Palestinian land in ways that are illegal, as we know. Interestingly, NSO, an Israeli tech firm, sold Pegasus software to the UAE, the Saudis and the Bahrainis, and that was used to spy on oppositionists and civil rights activists. Now, there's a company that, it's got a rather ominous name. It's called Dark Matter. It's a UAE company. It operates out of Abu Dhabi. It's actually right next door to the defense sector in Abu Dhabi. And it's responsible for Project Raven. I know this sounds like something out of a James Bond novel, but it's responsible for Project Raven, which was a massive offensive cyber operation that uses a system called Karma. And basically, it may be the case that without you realizing, without you doing anything at all, so clicking on a curious email or looking at that your phone is actually taken over. and to the extent that this conversation is recorded. My conversation to you is recorded. This is the sort of thing that the Emiratis are very keenly engaged in. I've described the UAE as a velvet North Korea. I think they are very, very sophisticated in terms of their surveillance of their own citizens, but also of their surveillance of people they deem to be enemies. So this cyber tool, Karma, allowed the UAE to monitor hundreds of targets beginning in 2016, from the Emir of Qatar and a senior Turkish official to a Nobel Peace Laureate human rights activist in Yemen. That's according to 5 former operatives and program documents. This is from Reuters. And Karma was used by an offensive cyber operations unit in Abu Dhabi, comprised of Emirati security officials and former American intelligence operatives. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why the Emiratis, are happy to play ball with the Israelis on the steal of the century, because there's big money to be made in the high-tech security and surveillance sector, and the Israelis and the Emiratis are keen to do business together. So, in summary, there are both economic and geopolitical motives that are behind the Emirati and Saudi support for the Kushner deal, and Palestinians are set to be sacrificed by the Saudis and the Emiratis for what are purely transactional reasons. There's no moral ground here. There's no moral space. There's no sense of fairness. This is just a transaction. And the Palestinians are not part of the deal, part of the transaction. So all that stands between achieving this outcome are the old king, Salman, and a supine government like ours, who refuse to challenge Trump and Netanyahu. Rather, again, for transactional purposes, we say, no, we are concerned, we have conversations in private, and we're having an influence, but we don't want to get too carried away because it'll cause problems. And we're in the middle of Brexit. We need jobs. The Gulf is going to offer us lots of potential. Let's just not go there right now. I think that approach has been shown time and again to be really what I would call a sellout approach. So the concern that I have is that the time is on the side of Kushner and Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed. So I would think that now Europe, the UK, and other governments, such as Canada's, I'm Canadian, by the way, not American, in case you're wondering, must speak up in defense of the rights of Palestinians to a viable state. That they must do it. These are democracies. They must speak up loudly and clearly. But I fear that, they won't, sadly. And also, we should not forget that within Israel itself, the majority favors a two-state solution. The majority wants to see fair and equal treatment for Palestinians. Why? Because the majority want peace. And they see that as the way to have peace. However, the minority has hijacked the majority in Israel. And we've seen it here with Brexit. The minority has hijacked the majority. It's happening all around us. So I was at a conference yesterday. I met a young woman. The conference is on UK and Middle East relations post-Brexit and focusing particularly on the Gulf. And this young woman works for an Israeli organization called, I hope my pronunciation is correct, Yashad. And they're supporters of a viable Palestinian state, side by side with Israel. Together for peace is their motto. She spoke about how Netanyahu and the extreme settler movement, heavily supported by Americans like the gambling mogul Sheldon Adelson, who is a multi-billionaire and has poured hundreds of millions into the settler movement over the years, how they have exploited the absence of strong leadership to impose their racist vision, not just on Palestinians, but on Israelis as well. And she was speaking about leadership within the Israeli political scene. She said, people need to speak up. And she said, and this struck me particularly, because she looked me straight in the eyes and said, this is not a time for cowards. So I call on our leaders in the West to stop being cowards, to speak up in support of Palestine and the Palestinians. And also, let me underline this is in support of the majority of Israelis. To completely reject this cynical maneuver and denounce unequivocally the deal for what it really is, the steal of the century. Thank you.
Bill, thank you very much for that. We'll come back to you in a few minutes' time with some questions we may have. I'm sure there are questions from the floor. I know I've got some. I'm going to hand over now, if I may, to Jenny Lynn. Jenny, welcome, and thank you very much for coming, being with us today. Jenny's an activist. She's a founder member and chair of the Halifax Friends of Palestine, which I think was set up in 2006. Jenny's also a member of the national executive of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, and she's also a councillor, and she's been a councillor since 2012, and you are a keen supporter and a proponent of your city of Halifax. Jenny, you're going to be hopefully shedding some light on what we can do here in the UK and more generally across the Western world, and what the role of civil society is if when the rabbit is apparently pulled out of the hat, if most Palestinians refuse to accept that deal, and that, of course, if we read what we've seen so far, read the responses to what we've seen so far, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of support amongst Palestinians for what's likely to be coming. So, Jenny, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I was going to stand, but I think if you can you all see me at the back? I'm very small, so if you can still see me, I will stay sitting down. Yeah, my name is Jenny Lynn. I hail from the north of England, and my first experience of political activism was fighting in support of people who were against apartheid in South Africa. And for me, that was particularly formative and is relevant when I think about what's happening to the Palestinian people. Because I was rereading, before I came down here today, Nelson Mandela's book, The Long Walk to Freedom. And there was a point in the 1970s when he was in prison, and they sent someone to talk to him, to try to say that he could get his freedom if he was prepared to just go to the Bantustan in Transkei, where his family were from, and have a bit of a quiet life. And understandably and not surprisingly, he refused, and he said, freedom and justice are not for sale. And my sense very much is that that is what the Palestinians are saying right around the world and what they are saying in Palestine. But I make reference to that because when I'm feeling particularly gloomy, I cheer myself up by remembering that in 1986 they were fighting on the streets of Soweto in Johannesburg. There was the ANC prisoners were still in jail. By 1991, Nelson Mandela was free. By 1994, almost exactly 25 years ago, they had their first free and fair elections. So in the space of less than a decade, things turned around. And that's what keeps me going when I'm feeling particularly gloomy about the oppression of the Palestinian people and how things just keep getting worse. I believe personally that Israel has realized that probably for the last decade, they are losing the war of public opinion around the world as far as the injustice that they're perpetrating on the Palestinian people. And I say that with reference really to recent opinion polls in America and internationally really, which would suggest that actually growing numbers of people, and particularly young people, are becoming increasingly disillusioned, and young Jewish Americans, in fact, are becoming increasingly disillusioned with what they see as the extreme activities of the current Israeli government. And so I think that the Israeli government recognised that once Donald Trump was elected, it must have been like, everything that they'd ever wanted had come home to roost. And I'm very grateful to Bill for enunciating the family connections, the business connections and so on, which I knew something about, but he's explained a great deal more. So really, once Donald Trump was in power, then actually it's my belief that the Israeli government must have thought all the Christmases had come at once and that they had to seize the moment. And so for the last couple of years or more, they've been determined to push back against the right of return of the Palestinian people, which, of course, as you know, was one of the aspects of international law, which was left, along with many others, including the status of Jerusalem and the borders and so on, which was left unresolved after the Oslo Agreement in 1994. And so as far as they were concerned, if they could remove the status of refugees, if they could say that the only people who remained as a refugee were people who had actually been physically displaced in 1948, then that was a number which was vanishingly small, alas, because many of those people are no longer with us. And so I, like many other activists around the world, was particularly inspired when I think civil society in Gaza, just over a year ago, gave us all a real jolt, because they started the Great March of Return. They started the protests every Friday to really wake the rest of the world up and to say, we are not going to be forgotten. We're not going to be wiped off the map. And I think many, many people, that was really a wake-up call in a way. And I think many people around the world were not only horrified by the violent response of the Israeli Defense Force, which has seen many people killed, many people severely injured, with limbs amputated and so on, many young people injured, many journalists shot, medics and paramedics shot and so on. Absolutely appalling way to treat an otherwise peaceful protest. But it seemed to me that it was really important, and that to me was an important sign of a pushback by civil society in Palestine, and particularly in Gaza, to say that they were not prepared to put up with this. And of course, when the Trump administration announced that they were going to move the embassy, the American embassy, to Jerusalem, supposedly an international city, a city for all people and all people and people of all faiths, we saw further demonstrations and many demonstrations, not only in the occupied West Bank and in Gaza, but in other countries around the Middle East. So I think the Israelis are absolutely determined that, as Bill has outlined, they have a plan based, no doubt, upon real estate, really, the facts on the ground, that they are determined to annex and to complete the annexation, if they can, of what little remains of the West Bank. Meanwhile, the people in Gaza are living in intolerable conditions as a result of the blockade, and many international humanitarian organisations have expounded very forcibly on how intolerable their situation is, and how unjust it is. And at the same time, this Trump administration is determined to cut all aid to refugees, and to try, allegedly, and pressure other countries which have been host to Palestinian refugee populations for many years, to say that what you must do is get them to effectively renounce their Palestinian identity and simply be absorbed into your own nationality, be that Jordan, be that Lebanon, and so on. And we know that some of those countries have resisted and pushed back and are not prepared to do that. So we need to, I think, before I go on to talking about the title of my talk, or the title I was given was, how can civil societies in the West support Palestinians in their refusal of the deal? And before I do that, I think it's also important to say that we all often talk glibly about America does this, and the UAE does that, and Jordan does the other, and so on. And for shorthand, we use the name of the country. But countries are more than just their name, and they're more than just their rulers. And it seems to me really, really important that we acknowledge the fact that in America there are many people now in organisations like Jewish Voices for Peace and others who are prepared to challenge the primacy of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. There are congresswomen and others who are prepared to speak out in support of Palestinian rights in a way that I think would have been almost unthinkable a decade ago. So that's America for you. And when we think about other countries in the Middle East, when we remember that in the Arab Spring, a friend of mine, I was never there, but a friend of mine said that a Palestinian friend of mine said that she was absolutely thrilled to see in Tahrir Square that half the flags that were being flown were Palestinian flags. So the people in different parts of the Middle East, it's my contention, ordinary people, many ordinary people, still stand with the Palestinian people. It's their rulers that are selling them out, and it's their rulers that think, for all the reasons that Bill has just expounded, that this is the way to get on, this is the way to transform their countries, this is the way to cozy up to Donald Trump. So what can we do, and what is going on? Well, as far as I'm concerned, our task in the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the UK, in the organisations, similar organisations in other parts of Europe, in Australia, in Canada, in the US and so on, if we care about justice for the Palestinian people and if we care about human rights, then our job is to campaign and to shout as loudly as we possibly can and to remind people that this is one of the great enduring injustices. In the same way that the colonialist aspect of what was going on in South Africa was one of the great injustices that went on throughout the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. And again, referring to, and I think the parallel is instructive, because as we have seen in parallel with what's been going on in the US, Israel, as we know, has instituted a whole number of laws, the nation-state law being the most recent, which are designed to impose a form of apartheid within Israel, which actually makes those the 20% of citizens of the current state of Israel, which makes them absolutely second-class citizens, and it's very interesting, really, that I was at a seminar a couple of years ago at the wonderful Pal Expo, which is happening this weekend, by the way, at Kensington Olympia, when one of the speakers there, we were talking about the two-state solution, and she said absolutely correctly, if we had a two-state solution and there was no change to the status of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, we still have apartheid in historic Palestine. And that's absolutely true. So it's not something that we can just sit by and say, well, that's how Israel is, and so on. And reference was made by Bill and by many others to the fact that inside Israel itself, there are a small but significant group of people, group of activists who are supportive of Palestinian human rights. Organisations like Tayush, who campaign to support the Palestinian farmers in the South Hebron Hills, who are constantly being harassed by the settlers there. Organisations like the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, who fight against, well, it does what it says on the tin, and it fights against the demolition, the illegal demolition of Palestinian homes in Silwan, in Jerusalem, and in other parts of the occupied West Bank. So, in terms of what can civil society do, there are small numbers of people in civil society, even inside Israel, who know that what is going on is wrong, who want peace, and who actually are prepared to envision a different way of living together. And in much the same way that I referred to Nelson Mandela saying that he wasn't prepared to put up with Bantustans, that he wasn't prepared to sell out the concept of equality and freedom and a non-racial South Africa. I believe that there are people, a small minority of people inside Israel and certainly in Palestine, who are actually willing to envisage a solution for Israel and Palestine, which is not racially or ethnically based, and I applaud that. So what can we do as activists who really care about human rights and about justice for everybody living in what was what was historic Palestine? First of all, I think many of us here will probably already be speaking up in support of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign, which was a call launched, as we know, in 2005 by over 600 civil society organisations in Palestine. And it's calling on us to emulate, in some senses, the tactics which were used in my youth to try to put the South African cause in front of people. And that was to say that there are things that ordinary people can do. They can be involved in a consumer boycott. They can challenge the attempt by the Israeli government and the Israeli state to insert itself into Europe, whether it's the Eurovision Song Contest, whether it's football or anything else. So, and there are many activists all around the world who are concerned to try to raise the possibility of boycotting the State of Israel until it is prepared to envision a return to international law and the restoration of the human rights of the Palestinian people. And of course it's BDS, it's boycott. So divestment is actually happening. When I first became involved in the Palestinian cause back in about 2005, 2006, the talk then was of trying to get an international company, French-based company called Veolia, to pull out of running the Jerusalem Light Railway and the Tovlan landfill site and other operations which they had, business interests. And there were all sorts of campaigns went on, and they did pull out. There's an international organisation, big international conglomerate called G4S, which again was very involved in operating both the software and the hardware involved in the prison system in Israel and the checkpoints inside occupied Palestine, inside the occupied West Bank. And again, G4S has bit by bit had to divest and pull back from that. And there are examples of churches, of government pension funds in Norway, lots of different organisations that are beginning to think about divesting. And in fact, my own organisation, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, has been involved over the last year and a half in legal proceedings to try to stop our own UK government from preventing local council pension funds from divesting from companies that are complicit in Israeli abuses of human rights. And in fact, I think that appeal, the final appeal of that case, which we see as being something about the freedom of local authority pension funds to make their own decisions, because remember, it isn't the government's money, it's the workers' money, and it's the councils who employ them. It's they who pay the piper, and they should be allowed to call the tune. So that case will be going to the High Court on November the 20th, I think. And then there's sanctions, and this is where it gets really interesting, because just as eventually in the struggle to free the South African people from the apartheid regime, countries and governments were persuaded to implement sanctions. So many people believe that the only way in which we can pressure our government at the moment about it, in order to get them to reject the deal, is to look at making demands on our governments around the world to say, sooner or later, you're going to have to recognise the injustice of what is going on here, and we're going to look to you to implement sanctions and a two-way arms embargo. Now, I don't believe for 1 minute, I'm not in fairyland or anything, I don't believe for 1 minute that the government that we have here in the UK, or certainly not the government in the US, are going to say, yes, we quite agree with you, Jenny. It's absolutely terrible what's going on. Of course we'll impose sanctions on Israel until they abide by the many United Nations resolutions and implement justice for Palestine. But we do know that, as I said before, civil society, ordinary people, are prepared to take action and to raise their voices and to say something must be done. And so all of us, we have 635 members of Parliament in the UK Parliament. Right around the world, wherever there are parliaments, people have got the people, and people are able to exercise freedom of speech. Then we do, all of us have the opportunity to try to make the case for justice for Palestine and for divestment, for boycott, divestment and sanctions. And as I said, another plug again for Pal Expo. There's going to be lots and lots of great meetings there. We've got a meeting on Sunday morning when we're going to be talking about the Stop Arming Israel campaign. And of course, as you know, the campaign, and this lawyer colleagues here will know that the campaign against the arms trade had managed to get an initial judgment, which will no doubt be appealed, an initial judgment against the British government recently in terms of arms sales to the Yemen, to Saudi Arabia, being used in the Yemen and so on. I've no doubt they will be appealed, and who knows what will happen with that. But the fact is that there are people of goodwill around the world who are concerned about the actions of Saudi Arabia, the actions of Israel, and who are prepared to consider putting pressure on their governments to say we need a two-way arms embargo. As you heard, I'm a Labour politician, and one of the most exciting things that happened to me last September was being in Liverpool and hearing a young activist from East London stand up and propose a motion calling for a two-way arms embargo on Israel and for recognition of the rights of the Palestinian people. And to see that sea of Palestinian flags, we gave out 1,000 Palestinian flags, and Unite the Union activists down at the front waving the flags and so on. OK, it's only a resolution, but it's an indication that a party which could, before very long, form the next government of the United Kingdom has a lot of people in it who care about justice for Palestine. So, and the other thing I should say is that this struggle goes on. I'm from the north of England, and we're quite tough in the north of England, and I'm very, very proud of the fact that there is a factory in a place called Oldham, which used to be run by a company called Ferranti and is now run part of the Elbit Systems, Israeli arms company. And there's been a rooftop occupation of the Elbit plant in Oldham for over 2 days. It's festooned with a big banner saying "Stop Arming Israel." There was a similar occupation in a factory in the south of England. And this was done to mark the fact that it's 5 years since the beginning of Operation Cast Lead, which killed over 2,000 civilians, Palestinian civilians. So my argument would be, many ordinary people, growing numbers of ordinary people here in the UK, but around the world, actually do care about Palestine. There are things that we can do. Can we win? Well, I go back to South Africa. Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Well,